starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Today we are starting. What's the matter? Can you see my screen? Just a minute, please. We'll be starting in just a second. I'm just trying to get my screen to show. We were in test mode before this, and we were switching screens back and forth to the presenters. So today we have frailty measures for persons with intellectual and development disabilities using aging care. I can move my slide. Okay, so just so that everybody knows, the webinars and the slides today will be posted on our website, and it will probably be within 1 or 2 days before they're up. And I'm just going to give an update, a quick update on the network. Currently we are doing our renewal for our second 5-year term, and we are actively looking for network partners to support our highly qualified personnel for both our interdisciplinary fellows and our summer student programs. And basically we are looking for matching of funds that are eligible from a tri-council perspective, and to approximately $4,000 for an SSA, and it could be in 1 year or the next 5 years. And fellows range from $12,500 to $25,000. And this could come from different foundations or departments or faculties, and we would match the program, and it, I think, would start in 2017 and go for the next 5 years. So if anybody's interested, please let Jackie St. Pierre know. She's our partnership person here at CFN. And we will be sending out letters in the next couple of days requesting this. So again, if you have any interest, please let us know. We also have a video contest. It's an open competition right now, and we're looking for videos on what frailty means to you. We've gotten some very interesting ones so far, and we're hoping that people will send in more. There are prizes, and all of this information is on our website currently. In the next couple of days, we'll be sending our regular newsletter out, and we will be including who has been successful in the last competition for our Catalyst grants, as well as our summer student program. We had expanded the summer student program from 10 to 20 this year. And so you'll see hopefully 20 new names coming out in the next day or two. A reminder that the annual progress reports for all your projects are due, or past due. We've probably received about 70%, but there's 30% or so that still need to send that to us. And the information we use for that is to put on our website, and as well we have to meet the NCE requirements, which is due the end of May, but we require it to go to our board for approval the week before. So we basically need to capture all this information from the progress reports, put it in a format that we can collectively submit. And so we really need those reports, and hoping that you will be able to send that in the next day or two using Forum, which is also on our website. So for today, we're going to do something a little bit different, or we hope it's a little bit different, and hoping that if you have some questions during the presentations, as there's 3 individuals who will be speaking today, and what they're looking for is if there's something specific in the area that they're presenting on, to submit it using your chat function, and as many as possible we will answer during the presentation. And if we can't get to them at that point, please submit them, and at the end we'll have a question and answer period and answer as many as possible. Again, I put it here for a second time. The webinar is recorded and available, and there's the website address. So today I have the privilege of introducing 3 ladies who will be presenting the frailty measures for persons with intellectual and development disabilities using aging care. We have the professor in the Department of Public Health Sciences at Queen's University, Elaine Kuntz. Oh, sorry, Elaine, I keep saying this wrong. Elaine Kuntz. And her research involves working with individuals with intellectual and development disabilities, family members, service providers, and policymakers. So quite rounded. The associate professor in the Department of Health Sciences at Lakehead University, Lynn Martin. I believe she is with Elaine today, and they will be presenting together. And her research focuses on the vulnerable population health and service utilization, with the emphasis on intellectual and development disabilities, aging, and mental illness. And then we have Catherine McKenzie, who is the project manager at Lakehead University. She obtained her MS from her master's from Queen's University. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Helen, and you can, I think, are the first speaker today. So thank you.
Hold on a minute. Okay. Thank you, Carol, and good morning, everyone. Our slides advancing. Oh, there we go. So I am Hélène Ouellette-Kuntz, and today we're broadcasting from multiple sites. I'm at Queen's University in Kingston. I'm joined by Catherine McKenzie, my former student and HQP, who's been working with us since graduating last year. And our colleague Lynn Martin is in Thunder Bay at Lakehead University. Our goals today are to increase awareness of the special circumstances faced by adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities as they age. We want to share with you our understanding of how best to measure frailty in this population and discuss what we've identified as challenges to implementing a measure of frailty for this group in different contexts. First, some background about intellectual and developmental disabilities and aging. Intellectual and developmental disabilities are a group of developmental conditions that are characterized by significant impairment of cognitive functions, which are associated with limitations of learning, adaptive behavior, and skills. We call them developmental conditions because they occur in the developmental period, which is typically before the age of 18. These conditions affect 1 to 2% of the population. They are lifelong. And common conditions that we associate with intellectual and developmental disabilities include autism spectrum disorder, Down syndrome, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and Fragile X syndrome. It's been well established that persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities experience health disparities. They have poorer health and poorer access to health care than those without such disabilities. As one example, some of our recent work here in Ontario has shown that adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities are more likely to have a number of different chronic health problems, including congestive heart failure, COPD, diabetes, and asthma. And not shown here is our finding that they are almost twice as likely to be diagnosed with a mental health or addiction problem, where the prevalence is 48%. While they're more likely to use primary care, they are less likely to receive preventive care, like an annual health exam or cancer screening. They visit the emergency room more, and they're hospitalized more often. They're also stay in hospital longer, and they're more often hospitalized for what we call ambulatory care sensitive conditions. Those are conditions that could and should be managed outside of hospitals. We also know that approximately 12% of this population is 65 years or older. That proportion has been increasing and continues to increase. Adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities are high users of aging care. Our analyses in Ontario reveal that they are twice as likely to use home care and 3 times more likely to be admitted to long-term care. Their use of aging services occurs at a much earlier age. Home care is highest in those in the 45 to 54 years of age range, whereas it's highest, if you look at the general population, we find the highest use among those 75 plus. As for long-term care, we find that over a 4-year period, 4.5% of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities in Ontario were admitted to long-term care, compared to only 0.7% of those without intellectual and developmental disabilities. In a third of those admitted to long-term care who have intellectual and developmental disabilities are admitted before the age of 60, and the corresponding proportion in the general population is less than 1%. It's important to understand that for persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities, aging in the community or aging at home has a very special meaning. As a group, they've historically been marginalized and segregated. A long era of institutionalization of persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities ended only recently in Ontario with the closure of the last institutions in 2009. While individuals and families favor community living, obtaining adequate health care and aging care in the community has presented challenges. While health care needs can be significant, there are multiple comorbidities and they can be unique in some ways. Often this uniqueness is related to the challenges with communication of symptoms and self-management. While we know this, we know of the complexity and the magnitude of health problems within the population, you'll recall that these disabilities only affect 1 to 2% of the population. This means that many healthcare professionals, unfortunately, do not receive adequate training related to this population generally, and much less related to their aging related needs. In Ontario, most specific supports for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities are provided through the Ministry of Community and Social Services through what is called the developmental services sector. This sector, while knowledgeable of developmental, social, vocational support needs of this population, often lack understanding of health needs and how to address them, and have only recently had to deal with supporting older adults as life expectancy has increased. There's therefore a need to understand the needs and the changing needs of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities as they age in the community. This is what led us to the field of frailty. We had been using administrative data housed at ICES, the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, to study a cohort of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So our first step was to apply the Johns Hopkins Frailty marker. We found that adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities were 3 times more likely to be frail after controlling for age, sex, and the presence of a mental health or addiction problem. We were, however, concerned by the higher rate found even in young adults. So we started looking more closely at the construct of frailty and how it should be applied in the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities. Not being experts in the area of frailty, we started by reviewing the literature, which led us to conclude that frailty should be seen as multidimensional, and that when used in intellectual and developmental disabilities, it should be adapted if it is to measure age-related decline. We identified the following issues with using the frailty marker in particular in this population. Since the frailty marker relies on diagnostic codes, it's heavily weighted on physical and physiological dimensions of health. As such, it fails to capture the broad range of characteristics that contribute to frailty. And since it is static, it ignores adaptation to pre-existing and lifelong disabilities. We therefore set out to develop our own measure. And I'll now turn it over to Catherine, who will tell you about this next phase of our work.
Thanks, Elaine. So, as she mentioned, I will be discussing with you the development and validation of a frailty index. Given the issues we faced with the frailty marker, we want to explore some other options. Many of you are likely familiar with the different approaches to measuring frailty, but please bear with me. Many have chosen to measure frailty using the phenotype approach developed by Freed and colleagues about 15 years ago, while others use the accumulation of deficits approach with methods developed by Rockwood et al. Around the same time. The frailty phenotype consists of a tabulation of 5 physical symptoms of frailty: weight loss, weakness, poor endurance and exhaustion, low physical activity, and slowness. The key difference between these two measures is that you can select variables based on the population of interest when using the accumulation of deficits approach. This allows for the selection of variables that are multidimensional and dynamic. This approach also emphasizes the proportion of health deficits a person has rather than the presence of specific symptoms. And there are other measurements, of course, of frailty that use multiple items, but we are not going to be focusing on those today. Using Arksey and O'Malley's methodological framework, we conducted a scoping review to better understand how frailty was measured and being used in the field of intellectual disabilities. We reviewed the literature between 2000 and 2015 using a complete list of search items for intellectual disabilities. We included studies in English and French that discussed a measure of frailty, included at least some adults over the age of 50, and presented original research. We then screened the articles and did full text reviews. We identified 14 studies stemming from the work of 3 research groups from the Netherlands, Austria, and Taiwan. The 11 publications from the Netherlands were from the Healthy Aging and Intellectual Disability Study. These analyzed data from a cohort of over 1,000 individuals from care providers in the Netherlands providing specialized support. Investigators from Austria, as part of the Pomona project, recruited volunteers from 8 health areas across this country. The study from Taiwan recruited individuals from a voluntary registry. I'm going to go into some more details about what we learned from the Netherlands and Austria. In the Netherlands, the 5 frailty phenotype symptoms were measured in 848 individuals with IDD over the age of 50. They reported that 13% of their cohort had at least 3 of the 5 symptoms, which indicated frailty, and 60% of the individuals were pre-frail, indicating 1 or 2 symptoms. Approximately 11% of their sample under the age of 65 was considered frail, which is similar to the published prevalence estimates of frailty in the general Dutch population aged 65 years and older. In a follow-up study, the same research group used an accumulation of deficits approach to measure frailty in over 900 adults using formal care. On a continuum ranging from 0 to 1, with a higher score representing frailty, the mean frailty score was 0.27, representing the presence of roughly 14 deficits, with an upper limit of 0.69. They also found that individuals with IDD had similar rates of frailty at age 50 as did the European population at around age 70, again supporting previous work showing that persons with IDD are frail at earlier ages than in the general population. Bremer and Weber created a frailty measure, the Vienna Frailty Questionnaire for Persons with Intellectual Disabilities Revised, which captures changes in 34 symptoms across 4 domains: physical, psychological, cognitive, and social. The presence of frailty is indicated if symptoms are present in at least 3 domains and a minimum of 6 symptoms are identified overall. Persons were described as pre-frail if only one of these 2 criteria were met. In their sample of 147 Austrian adults with IDD, aged 20 to 72, 17.7 were frail and 17.7 were pre-frail, the remainder were non-frail. We were then interested in the development of our own measure of frailty. We decided to use the rich data available to us from home care recipients. In Ontario, home care is typically the route to long-term care, and we wanted a measure that was predictive of future admissions to long-term care, given the importance of aging in the community, as Elaine discussed. We decided to use the accumulation of deficits approach. Using data from over 7,000 individuals with IDD assessed for home care between 2006 and 2014 in Ontario, we selected 42 deficits for the inclusion into the Frailty Index. To be included, deficits had to meet specific and validated criteria. For example, each deficit had to be positively correlated with age and associated with poor health, among other criteria. We had access to over 180 health-related variables provided by the RAI Home Care. The RI Home Care Assessment is mandated in home care provided by the Ministry of Health's Community Care Access Centres in Ontario at intake and at regular follow-ups. In the end, the process of selecting deficits resulted in a frailty index with these 42 items, which include physiological deficits, so for example, activities of daily living, stamina, dementia, pain, and other conditions, as well as cognitive, social, and psychological deficits. Over half of the cohort was non-frail at the time of their first home care assessment, and we consider non-frail to be a score less than 0.21, which is roughly 8 or 9 deficits. The remaining individuals were pre-frail, so they had between 8 or 9 deficits and 12 to 13 deficits, or they were frail. The mean age was higher in the frail group compared to the non-frail group by about 15 years. Frailty was positively correlated with poor self-reported health, and women were significantly more likely to be pre-frail and frail compared to men. After following the cohort for up to 4 years, almost 10% of individuals died without an admission to long-term care, while 22% were eventually admitted. Individuals in the frail group had rates of admission over 2 times as high as those in the non-frail group. Our adjusted model controls for age, sex, caregiver inability to continue caring, rural status, living situation, and cognition level. These survival curves show a similar finding. The probability of surviving and continuing to live in the community is much higher in individuals who are not frail or pre-frail compared to frail. Now I'm going to pass the mic over to Lynn, who will talk about these opportunities to implement.
All right, thank you very much. So maybe, Hélène, if you can change the slide, I'll delve right in. So as Catherine just presented, there is a literature on frailty among people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, albeit small, and valid measures do exist. And so the existence of such measures really allow for the possibility of action, right? Implementation of measures into practice to better monitor and detect early changes in functioning and possibly to improve care, but also system-level monitoring of frailty status to inform policy, as well as understanding of aging with intellectual and developmental disabilities, generally. However, it has been difficult to find published literature on frailty measure implementation practices, and there is no such literature on implementation of frailty measures in populations with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So this part of the study really aimed to begin to bridge that no-do gap by understanding the factors that contribute to implementation or lack thereof of frailty measures in the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we did this by interviewing key members of the 2 research teams who have published research on measures of frailty in populations with IDD, including the two people from the Netherlands that Catherine just presented on, and 2 from Austria. And so we interviewed the participants from the same research program together. The interviews lasted about 1 hour, and we audio recorded them to allow verbatim transcription for analysis. If you could change the slide, Hélène. Thank you. So the development of the interview questions was guided by the World Health Organization's Aging and Health Knowledge Translation Framework. And the aim was to elicit information from our participants on their experiences implementing a measure of frailty and their relationships with knowledge users. So the framework has 7 key elements, and we're going to begin at the top and then move clockwise. So, you know, for there to be uptake and use of information, there needs to be an appetite for knowledge and use of knowledge. The climate and the context has to value the use of research and recognize the presence of an information gap in the area. There also needs to be linkage and exchange between researchers and knowledge users, policymakers, practitioners, and other stakeholders
And these linkage activities enable informed policymaking and the transfer of research into practice. So to influence evidence-informed practice and policymaking, new research knowledge should be relevant, applicable, and timely to the people who could use that knowledge. Researchers also need to push the knowledge to the necessary groups in a way that they can easily understand. So most often that means, it needs to be free of jargon and really highlight the actionable items and actionable messages for them. We also need to engage in efforts to facilitate a pull from knowledge users, so make it easy for policymakers to acquire the relevant research evidence for their purposes. And knowledge users should also engage in those pull efforts, right? Where's somebody's phoning me right now? Sorry about that. So they should be engaging in efforts to acquire relevant research evidence. And these pull efforts are also closely linked with climate and context. So when they recognize the need and value research, they're more likely to engage in pull efforts. And last but certainly not least, we need to evaluate our efforts to link research to action to not only support our current activities, but also to better advise future knowledge translation activities. So as the interviews were structured around the these preset research objectives to understand how specific factors contributed to frailty measure implementation, we used a framework approach to coding the transcript, and this World Health Organization Aging and Health Knowledge Translation Framework was our coding framework. So the three of us really immersed ourselves in the data by reading the transcript. Catherine was the one who conducted the analysis. She was lucky enough to travel to the Netherlands and to Vienna. And we independently coded the transcript using this framework and created new codes if needed. And we reviewed the codes together to reach agreement and identify some supporting codes. We then organized these into themes and reviewed the themes and explored the relationship between them to try and explain our results. So Elaine, if you could change the slide. So basically the 7 elements of the Aging and Health Knowledge Translation Framework were addressed to varying degrees through the key informant interviews. Both teams were able to speak to the context and climate in their areas. So they explained to us the role of their respective social and healthcare systems in addressing aging in the general population as well. They talked to us about how neither really had an organization or a body who was specifically dedicated to aging in individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And in both groups, there were systems with a wide range of care setting options for people with intellectual disabilities, so living in the community as well as in group home or in institutional settings. Both of the research groups were involved in knowledge creation, so they had developed their own unique frailty measure, and they had published the results in academic journals, which reflected their knowledge push efforts. However, we did note that the journals that they published in were primarily in the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities, and extending those efforts to publish in journals where the focus is on aging in general or on geriatrics could help to get the information out there more broadly and increase interest in and knowledge about frailty among people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The team in Austria worked really closely with employees and clinicians in an organization to develop a frailty measure that was both scientifically rigorous and helpful for their practice so that they could use it with their clients. And so they really facilitated pull efforts, those clinicians did engage in pull efforts to get that information because they implemented. And so really in Austria there were these strong linkage and exchange efforts. And this was largely due to the fact that one of the researchers was also a care provider. And so she was able to both develop with her team and implement the tool to improve the care that was being provided to clients in their organization. In the Netherlands, the research on frailty was primarily contained to the academic universe, though they did have involvement of clinicians and care providers in data collection. neither group talked about any evaluation efforts of their interactions and the linkages that they had. So the interviews really highlighted two different approaches to developing a frailty measure. And having been developed with care providers, the frailty questionnaire, so the VSQ-IDR, was being used in practice in Austria, whereas the Frailty Index, developed as part of the Healthy Aging Research Initiative, was still contained within the academic setting. And so research is ongoing in the Netherlands, and they've been very prolific in terms of publishing, so getting that out, but it hasn't been implemented. And in Austria, while it has been implemented and it's being used, more publications have not been forthcoming, largely due to limited resources available within the organization for academic endeavors. So, and then if I could get you to switch the slide. So when we looked at our the whole of our results, we identified three important elements we think to facilitate, uptake of frailty measures, and implementation in practice and possibly policy in the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities. First, a clear purpose for the frailty measure must be articulated. So the need for a clear purpose probably isn't surprising, and it's been previously identified in frailty-related research as key to determining the approach to the development of the measurement of the measure. And in both of the research groups, the measure was developed with the purpose of being an objective indicator of decline in functioning that could inform future care activities, so physician referrals, medication monitoring, and those types of things. And that's the goal for a frailty measure that aligns with the goals of frailty tools in general. And so this clearly articulated purpose is important also within the context of push efforts. So it makes it easier to get the information necessary to the group in an appropriate format, very clear and simply articulated. And it also helps to facilitate and possibly inspire pull efforts, because it's really easier for policymakers to understand and acquire the relevant research evidence. Second, we think that an important activity is that the measure of frailty needs to be fully validated. So there have been 4 stages of validation, documented for building a predictive measure in practice or in policy. So there's development, validation, impact analysis, and implementation. In general frailty research and among our 2 groups, much work has been done related to the development and validation of frailty measures. However, less, and by less, I mean nothing that we were able to find, has been done related to evaluating the impact of the measures or its implementation. As such, these should really be the focus of future research, with these measures and any measure really, and can take the shape of a cost-benefit analysis or the results of an implementation feasibility trial. So we do need still some more knowledge creation in order to be in a position that we can really inform evidence-based policymaking in practice. The third action, and arguably maybe the most critical and probably not surprising, there needs to be explicit collaboration between researchers and knowledge users. So both early and continued collaboration are required to ensure that the frailty measures that are developed are useful, are relevant, and are appropriate to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and the care providers who will be using them and the policymakers who will be basing decisions on them. And so again, while the authors from the Netherlands have been much more prolific in terms of research publications, it's the measure that was developed in Vienna with explicit collaboration with the care providers that has been implemented. And so, and in speaking with the authors, they kind of credited that close relationship with the practitioners to design a specific tool that as what supported and facilitated a relatively quick uptake of their frailty measure into practice in Upper Austria. So these key findings, really do highlight the difficulty experienced by researchers in many jurisdictions and in many fields, in moving research beyond academia. In Ontario, Catherine talked about the work that we've been doing to develop a measure of frailty in home care. And really, we've developed and maintained strong linkages with knowledge users in both practice and policy, in both the healthcare sector and in developmental services sectors. And we've been doing that over the course of our entire project since its inception, really. And this appears to be slightly different from the approach taken by the other two teams. And also the frailty measure that we've been developing relies on the clinical data that's obtained from an assessment that's used as part of regular clinical practice in home care settings, so the RI home care, as Catherine described. And so, there are software systems available to collect this information, and the results can be used, by the care provider, but can also be aggregated for use by policy and decision makers. And this is also different than the approach taken by the researchers in the Netherlands and Austria, where new data collection was required. And so, again, we're hoping that this is something that will help to facilitate pull efforts and incite pull efforts, right, to use the information, because the information would already be there and available to practitioners. They don't have to do anything else in order to get that. And so we're also hoping that the relationships that we've had with practice and policymakers throughout will make it easier to potentially implement the frailty measure we've developed here in Ontario and possibly in other Canadian jurisdictions that have implemented the RI-HC. So if you could change the slide. So as part of this study, we had partners at RENA, which is a service provider organization, and they funded a knowledge translation webinar, which we held about 2 months after the end of our study, which was the scoping review and the interviews. And so in February 2016, our interactive webinar was attended by approximately 150 individuals from across Ontario, and it included direct service providers, managers, policymakers, and researchers in both the health and developmental services sectors. The webinar, really presented another form of linkage and exchange where we're pushing knowledge and facilitating pull efforts with a stakeholder group that we think had an appetite for knowledge related to health, aging, and IDDs. It was a good climate context, right? They registered for a webinar on this topic. And so the goal was to see whether in this primed group, whether they saw the value of the research that we had been doing and recognized its contribution to existing knowledge, and essentially to see would they be interested in further pulling. So kind of like what we did today, we talked to them about the various approaches that have been used to measure frailty, and most agreed that a unidimensional measure wasn't enough. So something that looked only at a physical frailty wasn't going to be enough for this population. And because our frailty work has been based on home care, we talked specifically about the various ways that this sector currently measures or tries to understand risk of adverse health outcomes. For example, there are measures that are being used in home care that look at health and stability. And there's an algorithm that's embedded in the RI home care instrument that helps to prioritize for services. And we also talked about, some of the implications of this use. So, for example, the measure of health and stability is unidimensional. It looks at physical health and stability. And the MAPLE algorithm that's used to prioritize for services is really focused on presence of cognitive impairment and impairment in self-care skills. And so they don't take into account, change in these or the fact that those two things are really present throughout a person's life when they have an intellectual or developmental disability. So like Eden was mentioning, some of the different limitations of the frailty marker exist with some of these. And so we talked to them about that and how we should go about to understand risk in this population. And about 3/4 said that the measure of frailty that we developed seemed to make sense and was probably more appropriate than some of the other measures that were currently being used and were developed for the general population. They talked to us about how our measure could be used to flag the need for geriatric screening earlier, because as was showed, people with IDD experience frailty earlier, and so this could mean that they could be seeking geriatric services as early as 40 or 50, and that there was the opportunity to share this the information with the individual's physician and with the developmental services sector, as Elaine mentioned, who also provide support to this population. He talked about the development of frailty profiles that could be accessed by individuals, families, and care providers. And this notion of home care professionals sharing assessment information with developmental services was reinforced later through a poll question that we asked during the webinar, where just under 60% said that felt that information was currently being shared between home care providers and the developmental services sector. And about 83% of our participants felt that the developmental services sector should have information on frailty for all the adults that they've supported, not necessarily just older adults and not just the ones who were being supported through home care. And so they also talked about the, they talked about the individual level applications, of a frailty measure in home care, but they also talked about the population level implications. So, for example, how it can be used to inform policy, determine funding, and forecasting future needs. And so that was interesting as well. Following the webinar, we met with the what's called the OPAD Collaborative, which is the Ontario Partnership for Aging and Developmental Disabilities. And this group was really interested in our work and implementation of a frailty measure for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities receiving home care. And some reps from home care even volunteered to pilot site. And so, this is great because it also allows, there exist opportunities for us to further validate the measure that we've developed in terms of looking at the impact of implementation, on outcomes, for example, and also do a feasibility trial in terms of how does this work if implemented. However, they also acknowledged some barriers. And so while they said, well, they understand and appreciate that there's no additional data collection that's needed for our measure, there will be resources implicated to incorporate the algorithm to calculate the frailty index into their current software solutions, systems, and into the output reports that are produced, as well as in terms of training people to understand what this frailty index measures and how it can be used. And in a time of fiscal constraint, they talked about how it would be difficult to get support to use funds when the target population, so people with IDD, is so small, so it represents less than 1% of the home care population. Next slide and last slide. I think I'm going over. Sorry. So what's next? What's next is we keep trying, we keep moving forward, we continue to strengthen linkages and exchange efforts through regular interactions that we have with this OPAD group. We're going to, again, in the OACCAC, which is the Ontario Association of Community Care Access Centres, and they have representation on OPAD, and we're meeting with them again in June, and maybe even hopefully leave with a few pilot sites. And we also continue to create new knowledge and, hopefully push it in a way that's facilitating pull and seeds a climate that's receptive to this information. We're currently being funded by the Ministry of Community and Social Services to examine change in frailty status among home care users with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and looking at change in frailty status when they live in the community and when they live in a group home. So next slide, to say thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Elaine, Lynn, and Catherine. You did a great job today, and we do have some questions for you. I think one of the first questions that comes up is really what was your last slide about, was what else do you have for your future plans for research in this area?
So I don't know if, so we've alluded to the developmental services grant. I don't know if Catherine maybe wants to talk about that a little bit more, about the major goals of that project.
Yeah, sure. What, now that we were unmuted?
Okay.
There's a bit of a break there, that was why. So we're looking at a bunch of things over the next year. We were really interested in looking at frailty over time. As you can imagine, that's a bit of a challenge to try and measure, and especially since we do have access to these assessments that are conducted routinely every 6 months or so, and over the course of 10 years. So we have a lot of data, and we can figure out frailty over time that way, but trying to figure out meaningful patterns is the challenge we're working through right now. We're especially interested in looking at home care services and how that can, what people receive and how that can influence how they change their frailty status, as well as the impact of living in a group home. So I don't have the number off the top of my head for how many individuals in our cohort of adults with intellectual disabilities live in group homes, but we're interested to see how that plays a part in frailty status and how that changes.
And I think one of the other things that we're working on, and we heard from the OPAD collaborative, right, was the difficulty in implementing something and finding the resources to implement something for such a small subset of the population. And so we're also involved in some larger work that's going on within the Inter-RAI organization that has developed the RAI home care and a number of other instruments that are used in different settings. And they've got funding right now to look at some way of measuring, frailty using the RAI instruments. And so we're working very closely with them to advocate for special considerations of the circumstances related to intellectual and developmental disabilities in those ongoing frailty efforts to make sure that, it's not just cognitive impairment that drives frailty, right? It would be changes in, because those things could potentially misclassify people with intellectual and developmental disabilities as frail if that's the focus. But also, once a measure is developed, to look at and compare with the measure that we've developed, and to look at, whether, well, if they're going to implement this general measure, are the same cutoffs for frailty as appropriate and valid among people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or is there some tweaking necessary? So I think that's where our focuses lie a little bit in the next year or so.
Okay, that was an opportunity. We were talking earlier about people to send money to you to continue your research. I'm sure you'll get a great response. I have a two-part question, and it might vary by province, but do group homes have the ability to use home care services? And part two to that question is home care, you said, was the usual path to long-term care. What would be the approximate percentage that aren't coming from the home care sector or the home care services?
On the first question of group home, yes, a group home, individuals who live in group homes supported by developmental services or other sectors can certainly apply for home care services, because group homes don't necessarily provide all the health-related care that is needed for a person. But we have found, however, that across Ontario there are a lot of differences in terms of what is being accessed, and whether that's a choice or differences in need or differences in the ease with which one can access different home care supports through CCAC for group home recipients is something that really needs to be looked at more closely. Your second question about what proportion might be admitted to home care without, to long-term care without coming through home care, we don't have that information. But it would likely apply mainly to individuals who are coming straight from a hospital into a long-term care facility.
Okay. Go ahead.
Or did know if Lynn wanted to add anything to that?
No.
No? Okay.
Okay. I think this is the last question because we are getting close to 1 o'clock. And on your slides, you do have your website information and have the ability, if anybody's interested in speaking with any of the individuals who are presenting today, contact information, I believe, is on your website as well, right?
Yes, that's correct. And we have copies of reports that we've done and publications that are posted on our website. So if people want more information on the work we've done, it's all available at mapsresearch.ca.
Okay, that's great. And so this will be the last question, and it's, do you have any data indicating whether or not family involvement mediates the effects of frailty?
Let me think about that.
Informal caregiver variable.
Think about that for a sec. Well, in the home care assessments, the RI home care assessment, there are variables that assess whether caregivers are in distress or whether caregivers indicate that they are unable to continue caring. And I know that when a caregiver says they were unable to attend at someone's first home care assessment, that was significantly associated with a sooner long-term care admission. So, and that was when frailty was controlled for. So if that answers your question, it is definitely a strong driver of admissions.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we know is when we study aging and intellectual disabilities, we also have to be thinking about aging in their caregivers. So individuals who are living at home with families, they are aging, but so are their parents. So there are many instances of 50, 60, 70-year-olds still living with parents that are 20 years older than them. So that's a big concern in our field of work.
Yeah,
and also of parents moving into long-term care homes or retirement homes and bringing along their son or daughter to live with them as well, regardless of what their frailty or health needs are. That's something else to consider.
Oh.
That's something that happens.
Interesting, very interesting. So I think that that's all the time we have today. So thank you, Ellen, Catherine, and Lynn. That was a great webinar today, and I learned lots. And I thank you to everyone who came on today, and hope that you can join us for our next webinar, which is May 25th with Greta Cummings. And again, I will say that the webinar will be posted in a day or two on our website. We will post your slides today, and that has the information to contact any of the presenters today to follow up on questions we were not able to answer today. So again, have a good day, and hope we see you next time on May 25th. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay.